Welcome to Policy and Politics with me, Tarun Nangia. With the corona pandemic ongoing in India, a lot of back and forth has happened in the diplomatic circles, especially with India's relationship with the United States of America, and also the messaging by President Putin of Russia. And of course, after a certain hesitancy in exporting raw materials to India, President Joe Biden of the United States of America indeed said that India has supported America when it needed hydroxychloroquine last year. India went out of its way, ignoring its domestic needs to export hydroxychloroquine, and that is why they are also going to export supports to India. Secondly, Putin also came forward and supplies have landed in India. So how India will navigate the relationship now with America and Russia in the Joe Biden era? We might all of us know that it's a very different era from the Trump-led administration, where Modi and Trump, in a way, they see a certain sort of an equation which was different. With Joe Biden, we have to know what that is, and who better than to discuss all of this with? I have with me Abhijit Iyer Mitra. He's a senior fellow with the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies and a well-known face in India's foreign policy circles as well as the defense issues. Abhijit, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you as always.
I will start with a comment that you made on a tweet that the MEA had put out, where the Ministry of External Affairs of India had said that President Putin is a friend, while the word friend wasn't used for President Joe Biden. Now, in any other circles, this would be missed. But do you think MEA will put out a tweet without thinking this? Do you think that tweet went along calling Putin a friend, but Joe Biden as somebody who the PM just spoke to?
It's a lot of things. That was actually the PMO tweet, not the MEA tweet. Okay. And if you go through the PMO's tweets, you'll see that he refers to he spoke to the King of Qatar, to the Amir of Qatar, and he says to His Excellency so-and-so Al-Thani. With Putin, it's my friend, President Putin. With Joe Biden, it's just Joe Biden. Now, the Prime Minister always thinks through his tweets. If you notice the way he tweets to Netanyahu, or the way he used to tweet to Trump, was very different from the way he tweets to certain other people. These things are calibrated. Note, he didn't even use the official designation, His Excellency or something like that. Why His Excellency, the King of Qatar, but not His Excellency, the President of the United States? And why my friend, President Putin? Right. There's definitely messaging out here. There's messaging. The problem, of course, is on the Indian PMO and PMO, at least. It's been impossible to extract information, at least since Modi took over, because the information loop is extremely tight, as opposed to the UPA and all previous governments, which used to leak like a sieve. In all likelihood, we used to get to know of prime ministerial decisions even before the prime minister would know what his decision is going to be, mostly. So that's been a change here. But what's very curious is we can get a lot of information out of DC. And what's been happening in DC is particularly curious because it's just one of those things where there's been an accretion of events and there's been certain faux pas. Let's just focus first before accretion events on the faux pas. Macron put out his tweet thanking India almost, supporting India almost a week back. The US president and the entire US system took a whole week after that to put out their expressions of support. Now, does France have a better intelligence network or something like that in India, that they somehow got to know of the situation before the American government did? Of course not. America will always have a much bigger penetration and much bigger diplomatic presence. Then what happens is Jen Psaki, the head of the White House, gets asked about the export of vaccines. She evades the question. 2-3 days later, the deputy vice spokesperson gets asked the same question, and he gives an extraordinarily pompous and honestly ludicrous remark. I don't know how he holds his job after that, saying that, India should be grateful that Americans are being vaccinated because one American saved is the whole world saved, or words to that extent. That's a kind of pompousness and insularity that even the very worst of, white redneck trash who would support Trump has never displayed. But this is now the White House deputy spokesperson or something like that. Then you finally have these expressions of support. Notice the initial expressions of support. Do you know the one word that was missing from all 5 tweets? Be it Anthony Blinken, be it the National Security Advisor, be it the Defense Secretary, be it the Vice President, be it the President. Tell me the one word that was missing, Tarun.
No, I can't think of.
The Prime Minister and Modi. They did not mention the PM. They did not mention Modi.
This is
and I had been calling up a lot of people in DC for the whole week prior to that. And what they were basically telling me was that, this is kind of comeuppance. They don't want to allow Modi to get away with his mistakes. Because the belief is in DC that Modi gets away with everything he does. Now, they then went on, once it became clear that America was now going to give aid, because the mood in Delhi had turned vitriolically against America by this time, and they realized they'd scored an own goal, they were still holding out. So remember, when in the initial tweets where Modi is not mentioned, they were desperate to not route that aid through the central government.
Yes.
They wanted it either to be G to B or B to B. They did not want it to be B to G or G to G. Sorry, just to avoid jargon. They wanted it to be government, US government to Indian business,
not government
or US business to Indian business. They did not want it to be US business to Indian government, and they did not want it to be US government to Indian government. Okay. And this you could completely see this reflected in the tweets that came out the next day after I tweeted about this. Then what happens is, within about 24 hours that changes, Biden calls up Modi, and then finally Modi starts getting included in the statement. And it then becomes that, we will give aid to the government as well. And a lot of it was because people were noticing what was being said. And remember, we were looking for clues in tweets only to validate what we'd already heard from our networks in DC.
Now,
it wasn't backward extrapolation saying, look at these tweets, therefore this is happening. It's we knew what was happening in DC, and we were looking for confirmation in the tweets, which we got. Not 1, but 5 tweets all at the same time.
Let me take you 4 years ago when you and me did a show where we discussed how India, in a sense, had moved closer to United States of America as defense procurements are concerned. There was certain concerns in Moscow about it. We remember Sergei Lavrov, who was the then Prime Minister of Russia, had made many visits to Delhi that time because they realized that a lot of procurement was not happening via them. The Russians also lost the Rafale deal, in a sense, the 5th generation fighting aircraft we did not get from Russians. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, if you see, Russians saw a lot of business being lost to America. We were growing close to America. And now suddenly it seems that has stalled. Because clearly the indication of India at that time was that we are moving towards America. It's not about two democracies. It's all, as you said that time, it's a lot about so much of trade and people-to-people movement is so much that it was natural that these countries had to come together.
Right.
What changed in the past 4 years?
Nothing changed in the past 4 years, incidentally. right? So in the MMRCA deal, which the Rafale won, it was the MiG-35, which is a further development of the MiG-29 that lost. And the fifth generation fighter was a completely different project, which was so atrocious. I mean, you could just see it was badly fitted out. The finishing was atrocious. The design was atrocious. There was literally nothing stealth to it. And, India finally pulled the plug after chugging along for a while. After paying our dues, incidentally, for the development and everything, we said, no, we're cutting our losses. We're not going with this program anymore. But, with Russia, we always made it clear to them that this was about China. And Russia's agenda always was that Russia by itself cannot manage China. We will get dragged into Chinese orbit, but Russia plus India, if we create a G3, Russia, China, India, the RIC, then the R and the I can balance out the C. Right? And of course, we were never going to be part of any grouping that, didn't recognize the fact that China is the primary security threat to India, either directly or via supplies to Pakistan indirectly. Right? So what has happened is, in the last 4 years under Trump, none of that actually changed. It continued as it was. Things have started changing since January 20 this year when Biden takes over. And there's a reason for it. This is a hypothesis. This isn't a fact. I mean, it's talking to a lot of people, but even they, unlike, say, the knives out for Modi in DC, which was all based on actual conversations that they've had with government, this is more an inkling or a sense that they have, which is why I want to stress that this is a hypothesis. The thing is that the president is not entirely all there. The vice president has no serious previous government experience in commanding such a vast range of resources. Being an attorney general or whatever in Canada, in California, is very different from being the vice president of the United States. It's literally, going from being the deputy commissioner of civil supplies in Koraput district in Odisha, going to be deputy prime minister of India. Technically, it's that kind of a promotion. You don't know half things. So you have a non-functional president and an out-of-depth vice president. And it turns out that most of DC is effectively being controlled by the very indoctrinated democratic power elites. And for them, because they are so doctrinaire and so insular, and they've been focused entirely on domestic politics, their reference to India is, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times, which was never the case with professional administrations before. It was never the reference point for Obama. It was never the reference point for Trump. It was never the reference point for Bill Clinton. It was never the reference point for George Bush. But it has now become the reference point for the people controlling this administration, the Democrat power brokers and things like that, number one. So what you've seen since January has been, and this was point number two, an accretion of events. Now, by itself, in the medical supplies thing, I told you, you can't make out a story. But when you add up everything that's happened with what Jen Psaki said, the delay in the tweets or whatever, then what the deputy White House press secretary says, finally the way the tweets come out, and finally the way the conversation happens, and finally the press statement that happens, you see a clear progression going from, oh, okay, we bit off more than we could chew. This isn't what we wanted. And then second round of the same thing, third round of the same thing, till it finally comes to the position that the Indian government always wanted, that you'll supply direct to the Indian government. Now, again, this is an accretion of events. Each event can be explained away individually. It cannot be explained away when you take it as a whole. Number one is the fact that the Quad was essentially downgraded to a climate change conference. Okay, I think you saw it. I saw it. Most of the viewers of this program would have seen it. I was going there gobsmacked. I'm like, when are we discussing China? When are we discussing security? This was never intended to be climate change. I mean, climate change can be, from a non-traditional security point of view and things like that, absolutely talk about it. But it wasn't even talked about in a securitized way. This was number one. Number two, you've had the so-called freedom of navigation operations. Where the US destroyer came and entered some economic zone in the Arabian Sea. Now,
if I may interrupt you, they've been doing this for the past 10 years.
I'm coming to that. Now, this isn't the first time that they're doing this. They've done this almost every year for the last 10, 12 years, except in 2018 and 2020. 2020 was because of COVID. 2018, I forget what the reason was. And they never publicized it. They used to bury it off in some report, annual report that of operations conducted and things like that. Second, whereas they used to always publicize the things they did with China. Why? Because America had a thing that, on the basis of, it is a matter of principle that we will keep the sea lanes of communication open, but we will not embarrass our allies. We will only embarrass our enemies. Number one. Number two, China's interpretation of an exclusive economic zone is territoriality. India's interpretation of an exclusive economic zone is we're not clear about freedom of navigation, which is why we allow free navigation. Which is why for these last 10 years, and even this year, the American ship was never challenged. It's like, bhai, jana hai to jao. Hamara kya hai? Why have we kept that nebulousness on EEZs, on the territoriality of EEZs? For a very, very simple reason that we can expand it in Andaman. It is a threat to be held over China. If China weaponizes and blocks the freedom of navigation in its EEZs and illegal territories and claims and whatnot, India retains the right to do that, and that will not be good for China, especially when it comes to the Malacca Straits going forth from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Right? This has always been very, very clear in the Indian mind. The second thing that has happened is that America always understood that these EEZs were mostly aimed at China and this sort of recessed threat that can be weaponized at a later date if China does something enough to necessitate India to weaponize it. But this year, what has happened is, mind you, India isn't the only one that's been targeted. Maldives and South Korea were also targeted, as far as I know, maybe other countries. Why would you put South Korea and India in the same boat as China? You are trying to portray China as the rule breaker. And mind you, South Korea and India don't send boats and ships to harass your ships coming in there. They don't fire on ships coming in there, unlike China.
Abhijit, where are we headed? I ask you this because Russians, in a sense, showed us that they could grow closer to Pakistan. They also showed us that in Afghanistan, they can edge us out from playing any role whatsoever because they saw India growing closer to America. But now there is a certain coldness with America, though, of course, trade relations and everything will keep on growing. We have a lot of businesses. They have a lot of investments. Principally with Russia, it's only a couple of industries where we trade in. Given this background, where are we headed? Because now it's neither.
Right. So see, with Russia, I'm going to differ with you slightly, which is that Russia, used to see India as a promise breaker. They finally, I think Putin at some point finally realized that India wasn't a promise breaker. We were just systemically used to tooting our own trumpets and overselling ourselves and not being able to deliver. Because, third world countries fundamentally an enforcement and delivery deficit state. I think there's some understanding of it. But a lot of what happened in Afghanistan was because of how deep the Pakistan lobby has crawled in. And it's admirable to the extent that Russia has prevented that lobby from getting any worse. If you remember, when we were discussing Afghanistan on the same program, I think 2 or so years back, I was telling you that almost everybody agrees that Zamir Kabulov is dancing to an ISI tune, and he's probably not even dancing to the Russian president's tune, no matter how he tries to pass it off. Zamir Kabulov is a particularly dangerous and compromised man, and there is a certain clique within the Kremlin who subscribes to his particular worldview. In spite of that, remember, Russia hasn't cozied up to Pakistan the way, in any way remotely close to the way we have cozied up to America. So there's a fundamental lack of balance in comparing the two, because Russia is still not willing to sell offensive weaponry to Pakistan. Let's be very clear about that. Okay, this is number one. But coming to the future, where is this relationship going in the future? The telling it is now CATSA sanctions, which is sanctions on India for buying Russian equipment, specifically the S-400, will be the key out here. That will tell you which clique in America has won, the old guard that does not want to rock the boat with India, or the DNC power elites that do want to, the highly woke, who do want to rock the boat with India, who unfortunately, given the current, neutralization of both the president and the vice president in decision making, seem to be holding the power in DC at the moment. So to connect this with what was being said in the past, one is the snafu with relief to India for COVID. The second is freedom of navigation operations. The third is the, sorry to use this word, but the castration of the Quad effectively. And this is where number 4, which is CATSA sanctions coming. This is the determinant of the future. Because remember, the moment CATSA sanctions are announced, forget implemented, the moment they are even announced, you know the strategic trust is just broken. There is no coming back from there. As it is, the non-alignment lobby in Delhi is very, very strong because institutional memories are so strong. Once this comes about, you have basically entered the path of no return. Because after that, there is going to be no American purchase of equipment that isn't going to have a huge question mark around it. Right? Now, understand, avoiding the CATSA sanctions isn't so tough. Because remember, we're not in the same boat as Turkey. Turkey is a NATO country. By NATO standards, everything has to be integrated into the NATO combat management system. There is an extremely high level of integration and interlinking and very secretive data links, encrypted data links and things like that. With India, in that sense, because we are not so integrated, and we certainly don't use NATO data links and things like that, the threshold for sanctions is very different from the threshold or the criteria for sanctions is very different from the criteria applied to Turkey, as in the threat analysis of buying the same S-400 missile system. Turkey has now been permanently kicked out of the F-35 program, and there are all kinds of sanctions on further sales and things like that to Turkey. India can make a case that, look, we are not integrated. We are not going to integrate the S-400 with any American system. We are not going to co-locate it with any American system. There are certain ways, there are parameters and ways of avoiding, avoiding co-location and things like that. For example, the same criteria that America has used with Pakistan and Chinese fighters, that F-16s and Chinese fighters or Chinese electronic aircraft cannot be co-located. If they're co-located, they have to be under 24-hour surveillance and things like that. There are a lot of measures I'm not going to go into.
So I want to ask you, now it is a given that India is going to procure X-400 from Russia. The deliveries are to come sometime in 2022, early 2022. Yeah. So now CATSA, as you said, is combating America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, which means since it is signed as a law, sanctions have to automatically kick in if we procure S-400 from Russia. So for the sanctions to not kick in, it's the president of America himself, he should decide. Yeah. So which means he is, so the decision now has to come right from the top. Otherwise, in normal course, sanctions are going to happen. Yes. Though I have read in a few articles that the sanctions are mere slap on the wrist. It will not have any big impact on India.
No, that is not entirely true. It will be, if the sanctions are imposed. See, it's not a question of the operational effect. It's a question of the destruction of strategic trust. Because we have grown closer to America based on the fact that America isn't going to use all these double standards and triple standards and all of that and sanction us like they did in the past. Right? Number one. Number two, operationally, the impact on us won't be as great as, say, the operational impact on Turkey. Why? Because they're much more integrated into NATO. But that is not a function of the sanctions. That is a function of our level of dependence on American equipment. The third is the waivers come through American presidential assent, or the president signs the waiver, for which you have to take certain actions here, there, which is easy to manage. It's not such a headache. It's a headache, but it's not such a headache. You then say, this, we will commit to do this. The president is happy, therefore he gives you a waiver. Okay. The problem is, it's like the Presler Amendment. It had to be certified by the president every year, and once you fall out of favor,
if I may interrupt you at this point, India has gone to great extent to placate America. We were not able to pay our oil bills because the economy has not been doing particularly well in the past few years. We stopped crude procurements from Iran, despite having a strategic interest in the port, the Chabhar port there. Despite that, despite strategic interest into Central Asia, we still stopped buying crude from Iran. The America establishment would be looking at all this also.
No, they won't. And see, that is the sort of the genius and the malignance of CATSA, because it isn't linked to good behavior or compliance to American foreign policy goals in other spheres. It's a standalone. It is only based on defense. Okay. If you are buying things from America, specifically. So that's still fine. But there is no room for this kind of cross negotiation. We hurt ourselves on Iran, so you take a hit for us on the S-400 kind of thing. We can't play one off against the other, right? The trading and bargaining that will have to be done will have to be defense for defense. Specifically, some kind of a protocol to see to it that the S-400 does not interact or is not interfaced with American equipment. Right? That is the main thing.
So basically, you mean there are fears about bugging and everything?
Not unfounded fears, because the Russians are fantastic at information warfare. Let's not forget that. The S-400 could very well act as an electronic spy post, collect all kinds of data, and when its maintenance schedules are there, that data could be downloaded and used up for things. Because remember, we are buying completely assembled units. We're not even assembling them. So we don't even have a deep knowledge of its assembly and where the malignant modules could be and things like that.
So in fact, to sum up today's discussion, we are entering a time where we are not entirely clear on where the relationship with America or Russia, or for that matter, is headed, as Prime Minister Modi will go into elections in 2024. We don't know at this moment. It will be decided by the events that unfold in the next 1 year.
Correct. Exactly.
So I think we are almost out of time on today's episode of Policy and Politics, but it is not the end. We intend to do one more episode on this, where we will take forward this discussion, because this is very interesting time in Prime Minister Modi's prime ministership. We've seen how the relationship has been developing since 2014. With Biden coming, how the equations have changed. And suddenly India's stance towards Russia seem to be changing. Whether these are just overtures or really there could be some development will only be known in the next 1 year. So we'll wait and watch for that. Thank you so much, Abhijit, for joining us on Policy and Politics.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.